3, 2.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. It's Friday, November 4th, and this week we're taking a look at the return to power of two leaders who we'd long counted out, with one spending time in prison and the other seemingly heading there before he got elected. Last Sunday, Lula da Silva returned to victory in Brazil, and on Tuesday, Bibi Netanyahu won a decisive victory, the first in 5 elections. Then we'll take a look at Ethiopia, where a brutal civil war costing hundreds of thousands of lives and millions are starving may finally be at an end. Here to talk about all of these issues are Bobby Ghosh, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you back.
Nice to be back.
Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker and co-author of The Divider, an insight look at the Trump administration. Susan, great to see you back again.
Oh, thanks so much, Ivo. Great to be with you.
And James Harding, co-founder and editor of Tortoise Media. James, great to have you back.
Thanks, Ivo.
So start with you, James. Brazil, really a remarkable election, a remarkable comeback of a man who was accused of corruption, ended up in jail for months, released, his sentence undone, and there he went back to reclaim the presidency that he stepped down to many years ago as probably the most popular leader, as I think Obama said at the time, ever as president. 87% support. He's back. And what does it all mean? At least we think he's back, because there may be some issue about who is conceding or not conceding. So bring us up to date about where this is and what it really means.
So I think you're right. It is an amazing week, isn't it? You say a comeback week. I was just thinking, just as you were framing that, Lula and Bibi, people who you can capture their name, their brands in their own right, and yet they are. It's not comeback kids, is it? It's sort of comeback oldies with a whiff of corruption about them, as you say, either for time in prison or for corruption allegations that surround them. But I want to try on you a version of what's happened in Brazil that is slightly different, I think, to the one that we generally reach for in Lula's victory over Bolsonaro. And this is not my mastermind subject, but I've spent the last few days speaking to a fair few people there. And one of the things that strikes me is that we may be in danger of doing that thing, which is assuming that the external impression of a country is how it's being read internally. And here's why. So the Lula victory over Bolsonaro, the shorthand account of it globally would be this: the Amazon rainforest has breathed a sigh of relief. Bolsonaro is going, Lula comes in with a greater commitment to climate and to combating environmental degradation in the Amazon, certainly true. And also that Bolsonaro, in some ways, if you like, a sort of not too distant relation in the populist family of Donald Trump, or even in my country, Boris Johnson, people think Lula's win is a blow against that kind of populism. But I think there are things to consider in the 49+% of the country that voted for Bolsonaro that's worth considering. This is a country that is divided very, very evenly politically, extremely polarized, but by the numbers, very evenly divided politically, and enormously polarized economically. So you have essentially a 50 and a bit, 49 and a bit split politically, and you have a 91% of GDP voting for Bolsonaro and 9% of GDP voting for Lula. So the implications of that, I think, are really profound when you think of the expectations now on Lula's government. Namely, how do you begin in a very, very stressful world economy, not least with a strong dollar and rising interest rates, to deliver the kinds of economic transfers that 50% of the population that sits on just 9% of the wealth that would be required of Lula. So that's one thing to think about. And I think the other thing just to think about is this, is in many ways, Lula is on the left of his party, particularly after his time in prison. But Bolsonaro is interesting. He's much further to the right of where many of his voters are. And if you look at the way the congressional vote broke down, actually it's more center and more center-right. So I think there's also an argument here for being slightly more optimistic than the polarized picture would suggest. I.e., you've got a center-right Congress which might be more willing to do business with Lula than, for example, the left would have been willing to do business with Bolsonaro. And so you may actually see things getting done in Brazil that I think would suggest there's reasons for being encouraged. And just one final thing, I think you're right about worrying about the concession, i.e. did he or didn't he? In a very Bolsonaro type way, he has conceded. He has left, I think, too much room for people to protest on the streets, but it is clear that Bolsonaro's team is transferring power to Lula, and he's taking that power straight away to COP.
James, a lot of good points that you put on the table here to bite into. Bobby, pick up on any of the points that James had, but let me add just one other, which is to think about what does the return of Lula, assuming he returns, we get over that hump, mean really for foreign policy. I mean, Bolsonaro had sort of abandoned the BRICS idea. He was much closer to the United States, at least while Trump was still in power. Lula was the originator of the BRICS, working together with Russia, India, China, and South Africa. He's already made clear that his view of the war in Ukraine is not the same as those in Europe and in the United States. And he's looking to China and Russia really, and India and South Africa, really as a sort of an alternative power center to get stuff done in the world. Is that likely? It's been a long time since he was able to work those issues when he was president, and things have changed, or is this something that we should be paying attention to?
Well, the world has changed quite dramatically since he was last president, and the war in Ukraine is only one manifestation of it. To your point about BRICS, it was striking to me that Narendra Modi was very quick off the mark to congratulate him on his victory, pretty much, I think, as soon as Biden had done. Big important member of BRICS immediately endorsing his win. And Lula may still harbor this notion of a third front in the world, but BRICS itself, what does BRICS mean when Russia has gone off on its own, this sort of mad misadventure in Ukraine? I don't think BRICS sort of as an edifice in a political sense has much to offer. So if Lula wants to create or want to be part of some sort of a third front, that front would have to be independent of, it would have to be a fourth, three and a half, so shall we say, with the US on one side, Russia, China, and then a third front, non-aligned movement, to give it a name that echoes through history. I think to the point that James made, the constitution of the Brazilian parliament is very interesting. No party has anything like a majority to ram through legislation. And I think James's point is absolutely correct that it is center-right, but Lula, when he was last president, showed a capacity to work with parliament. He is actually, or at least was, good at making deals with different factions within parliament to get legislation going. And that's going to be a very important quality. That is something that, he will not use the big hammer in the way that Bolsonaro did, but quiet suasion is more his style. And so we have that to look forward to. On the other hand, Lula, when he was last president, had a quite sizable majority he won by a significant vote. The country was not so polarized as it is now. So there are new challenges for him to face. But on the whole, I'm optimistic that he can get legislation moving within domestic legislation. On the international side, I'm less certain. I think the world has changed a great deal, and from what I've heard so far from Lula during the campaign, and doesn't strike me that he's fully appreciated how much the world has changed.
Susan, in terms of this idea that maybe the country is not as polarized and they are able to work together, you put on your U.S. hat as well as part of the thinking about this. I mean, Bolsonaro has not quite gone about it the same way as Donald Trump did after losing the election, but he's not also gone the way we would expect Democrats to do so. And there is this question of how that will affect politics. It's clearly affected politics in our country a great deal. Bolsonaro, of course, can come back. He may decide that he wants to run in 4 years again. Doesn't seem to be that strange that that were to happen. So if you were to take sort of your analysis of how politics in these kinds of situations play out, what should we be looking for in the next few weeks and months in terms of the impact of Bolsonaro's not yet concession, which is real, having on the politics and possibly even the ability of Lula to govern thereafter?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ivo, because I do think listening to this conversation, right, there are unfortunately eerie echoes, not just for the US, but for many of the societies that are experiencing this sort of extreme polarized politics, often despite having relatively centrist majorities. And I think that's what, James, like really struck with me, is that there's an optimistic scenario in which legislation is possible across a seemingly vast partisan divide. But then there's also the other scenario that arguably we've seen play out here in the United States and, in several European countries, which is to say that there's a much more centrist majority than it appears from the extremist leadership in the parties, and that in fact those leaders end up fueling a cycle of additional fragmentation, polarization, and leading to essentially disillusion with politics, distrust of institutions, and further fueling the political instability. And unfortunately, I think it's that doom loop scenario that, Ivo suggested, where Bolsonaro, certainly we should look to see, does he continue to foster uncertainty and grievance among his supporters? Does it appear that he is continuing to remain on the political stage or prepare for a comeback? What is the role of media in stoking grievance about either a stolen election or the idea that a small minority of the country is now going to foist its views upon a larger almost majority? And I think we've seen all of those things as we were about to begin this conversation today. It appears the news is broken that Donald Trump is preparing to announce his return to politics on November 14th, his presidential campaign. And, it's exactly, the kind of delusion scenario that I think we've seen from so many people. They say, oh, well, it's okay because we elected fill in the blank, a centrist coalition in Israel, a liberal or, even a progressive left winger who knows how to govern, at least in Brazil, a centrist veteran like Joe Biden. And, it's however, turns out to be a kind of fantasy interlude. And I do think the doom loop scenario is one that you would at least want to put high on the list for Brazil in particular, given the almost 50-50 split of the country. Those voters who have lost don't just go away, and depending upon the actions of the leader. And I do think Bolsonaro's actions will be important in signaling to those voters. Donald Trump's actions obviously were crucial here. And, there's always individual choice. Again, we can talk about it, but obviously Republicans made a calculated decision to stick with Donald Trump because they wanted his voters, and either lied to themselves or simply lied, publicly about the idea that, it didn't mean they had to keep Donald Trump around too. I'm thinking of Mitch McConnell here, but he wanted to win badly enough that once again, he made that choice. And So we are where we are. But on Brazil, just in terms of foreign policy, that's a really interesting part of this conversation too. And Bobby, alluded to it. I agree that, the BRICS don't seem to make all that much sense in the current geopolitical climate. However, I would note that I've been struck by the persistence of Putin's success in spreading his kind of inverse version of reality with regards to Ukraine across the countries, not just of the former BRICS, but also, more broadly in, the developing world, whatever you want to call it, the global South. And, I just was speaking with somebody who came back from Indonesia the other day and could not believe the extent to which this narrative of Russia's grievance had engendered sympathy for Russia in this conflict of its own making, rather than seeing Ukraine as victims of a neo-colonialist war of aggression. And I just think that you've already seen some of the commentary from Lula about Ukraine and Russia that is kind of striking. And as much as we in the US tend to layer onto this development, oh, great, the Trump of South America has been thrown out. I think that there's another way of looking at it in which it's not quite the kind of great news that one might think.
Yeah, just picking up on, and James, I want to come back to you as well, but picking up on Bobby and Susan's point on this foreign policy piece, I think there's an opportunity here, if Lula plays his cards right, to actually work with India and South Africa, and to be the leaders of that third bloc. If they're smart, they don't fully buy into the Russian narrative. They just pox them both your houses. The war itself is the problem. It's a problem on prices. It's a problem on food. It's the problem on, and then who's to blame? They're both to blame because they're big powers and they're terrible and they shouldn't be there. That allows you the opportunity for India to take a more independent perspective, for South Africa to do the same, and so maybe we get to the BIS rather than the BRICS, and Lulu sort of being part of that, which we haven't seen. We haven't seen that sort of third way. Non-aligned, as Bobby put it, materialized in part because Russian propaganda and disinformation seems to have worked its way into the politics of these societies. But it strikes me there's an opportunity there. James?
I think so, Ivo, but I'm not sure. And I'll tell you why. I think if the last year has been defined by two really huge rivalries, East-West, US-China, and obviously Russia versus the West, and most proximately Russia versus Western Europe, the election of Lula, in the same week that you've seen another increase in US interest rates to historic levels and this continuing strengthening of the dollar, means that a rivalry that we've underestimated in the last few years between North and South is going to reassert itself. Because the thing that's easy to underestimate is just quite how difficult a very strong dollar makes life for many countries around the world, particularly when food prices are going up, particularly when energy costs are rising. And so if you have in Lula a politician who can not only galvanize the left in his country, but the left globally, and at a time where certain markets and certain countries are going to be destabilized, I think you're going to see a north-south politics that you haven't seen for a few years. And I wouldn't be surprised if it starts next week. I wouldn't be surprised that when people arrive in Sharm for the COP meetings, that they begin to see an accumulated anger around vaccinations in COVID, around the economic fallout of Putin's war and the reaction of the West. And now they say, and look at the economic demands that a strong dollar is going to put on us. We are fed up, and we're fed up with picking up the bill for climate too. And the South-North divide, I think, could get quite a lot stronger. So I agree, by the way, with Bobby, that I think that there is quite a lot of room for optimism around Brazil itself. I think things will get done, and I think there will be a new energy, and I think there should be some relief to see Bolsonaro leaving, given his, populist credentials and particularly policy on the Amazon. But I'm not entirely convinced that Lula has this kind of diplomatic opening with the West that you suggest. At least I think he might play it differently.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, no, Bobby, please go, please.
No. This is a sidebar. This is not directly linked to the topic, but I was at a seminar conference in Istanbul a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that was discussed was the fact that the global South, despite the horrific images that have emerged from Bucha and the sort of abundance of proof of the abuses that the Russians are committing in Ukraine, that, to Susan's point, the global South continues to, if not be sympathetic, then certainly closer in their view towards to Russian position than to the Western one. And one of the reasons for this, historical reasons, economic reasons, but one of the reasons for this is that actually the global South hasn't heard from Zelensky. The Ukrainians, and you know, I understand why. He's so busy trying to keep the West united behind him. That's, you know, I can understand that is taking up so much of his time. He needs their support, he needs their money, he needs their weapons, but he has not really directly communicated with the global South. And so as a result, it has fallen to the West, Europeans and the United States, to try to persuade the global South that Russia is the bad guy here. Well, there's a credibility gap there. If the US can't, or the West in general, Europeans certainly can't speak to the global world about imperialism and Russia because of their own dated history in this. The only person who has the real credibility to make that point is Zelensky, and he's too busy talking to the West to talk to the South. Anyway, sorry, this was a kind of
no, I think it was if a sidebar, it was a pretty central one. It's a very, very, very good point, and I think James is absolutely right, and we'll see next week. I think the emergence of a global South and the North-South dialogue is right. I'm not sure that the Russians and the Chinese can count that they're going to be part of the South, and that's the opportunity for Lula. It seems to me to be, you know, with Modi in particular, to see if they can figure out a way to not only express but mobilize the grievance, in many ways the right grievance of the global South against the North. An interesting point to watch. Susan, I wanted to move on to Israel, where we really had a surprising election, where for the first time we now have a clear majority bloc, although the majority is built up from, as usual, some shady characters. Tom Friedman, I think, put it right that this is a very different Israel than we knew. Bring us up to date about the elections and what it really means for how we should think about the country, and as a result, the relationship between this country and the United States, which, after all, has since the 1973 war been such an absolute central element in Israeli politics and in Israeli security.
Well, speaking of doom loops and grievance politics, I do think that the return of Benjamin Netanyahu is a reminder of, the sort of gridlocked stalemate politics of, many democracies right now. And, Tom Friedman's view, we can talk about that, is that this is the off-Broadway production, and, it's a preview of the extremist version of Trump that we would see, were he to come back to power, even more untethered from norms of constitutional democracy. And that certainly is an element of this that's going to bear watching, which is the extent to which the return of Netanyahu actually represents his and his coalition's efforts to attack, sort of the basis of the Israeli system itself. That, I think, was a striking quote from Tzipi Livni, former foreign minister of Israel. And she made the point, and others have as well, that this is about actually revising, core principles of the democracy in Israel in a way that looks to make it a significantly less democratic country after years of, using this label of the only democracy in the neighborhood. It may soon no longer really in a technical sense be worthy of that goal. I'm struck by the fact that it is not only an ultra right-wing coalition that Netanyahu has formed that's far different than the governing coalition that he had just a year ago when he was thrown out of power, but that it really is one that is going to be much less responsive to the broad views of Israeli society as a whole. This goes exactly to James's point about, what happens in these polarized countries where you have an electorate that might not be as different as the leaders who are chosen to represent it and are therefore pulled farther and farther away from a reasonable governing center. And I think that's exactly what we're looking at happening in Israel right now. Who are the ultra nationalists that Netanyahu, who once shunned these same people, has chosen to get in bed with? They're literally one of the leaders of the two parties that will now make up the third largest bloc in the Knesset, was such an extremist that he was not allowed to serve in the Israeli military because they deemed him a security threat. And this is what we're talking about. Why? Well, some of the same things that I think could apply to a Trump return to power, to a Bolsonaro, because Netanyahu is literally on trial at this moment. And so one of the governing ambitions of this new group is to take over and to politicize the Israeli Supreme Court and to shut down the prosecution of Netanyahu, which has literally been going on for years. And I think this is very significant when you look at these questions of accountability and rule of law. Trump right now in the United States is under investigation, not just for random misdoings that have to do with his business, which is under a civil trial in New York, but for things that went to the heart of him as the president, the former president, and the leader of one of the US's two political parties. And he essentially holds the view, as do that of his followers, that he's got impunity, that he is really not accountable under any process of law for anything that he would do in his role as president or former president even of the United States. And I think that applies in Israel as well. And so I feel like it's a very significant development. To your question about how does it affect its core security relationship with the United States and its sort of recent foreign policy. Netanyahu obviously has been an architect in many ways of the openings to to Arab states in the region, to making common cause with Gulf Arabs was something he identified quite early on, long before the Abraham Accords. This was a very explicit Netanyahu policy, in some ways separating out the question of Israel's internal Israeli Arabs and also its issues with the Palestinians in the West Bank, separating that very purposefully from the interests of the Gulf Arabs. That worked largely, and it seems to, I think, be on probably a pretty ineluctable path, because you are seeing, integration and business and commercial dynamics that will be hard to reverse, I suspect. However, this question of Israel in recent years in the United States becoming an extension, I think, of our own domestic political divides, and politicized in a way that you've seen a new generation, certainly, of Democrats, not just uncertain about Israel, but actively hostile to it, and Netanyahu and his faction almost becoming a wing of the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party looks to be coming back to power, at least in the U.S. Congress next week, and so it's a little bit too early to say, what will happen there. But to the extent that the Biden administration is perceived as potentially a lame duck administration, I think we're in for a period of uncertainty and gridlock in the relationship with Israel, but an acceleration of the ongoing pattern of it being seen, you know, Republicans having one view of Israel and Democrats having another very, very different view of Israel.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that domestic politics already starting to playing out. And Bobby, I just to Susan's point, I think the relationship, particularly with the Gulf Arabs, to Bibi was a good one. But now that Bibi is bringing into his coalition a set of actors who, frankly, are making being anti-Arab the core of their political identity, and not just Palestinian Arabs, but Israeli Arabs. Is that going to have an impact on how the Gulf looks at the relationship with this government?
Well, there's some reporting out of Israel that suggests that the Emiratis have already expressed their concerns to Bibi and have said that if Itamar Ben-Gvir has a prominent position in cabinet, they will not view that kindly. I don't know that they have they're going to be able to make that happen, or that Bibi has a choice in this matter. If we assume that Ben-Gvir will be in cabinet, well, several things to do with the region now then come into play. One, I can't see the Saudis joining the Abraham Accords in that set of circumstances, even allowing for MBS being this sort of unpredictable character. What happens to the recent rapprochement with Turkey? That suddenly comes into play again. And then this deal that they made with Lebanon over the maritime borders and exploitation of natural gas in the Eastern Med. Netanyahu is already on record saying that he would treat that deal in the same way as he treated the two-state solution, which is to say that he will just ignore it, and that's not a good sign either. So I think the Iranians, of course, will now be acutely aware that they have a very hostile, the return of a very hostile adversary, and it's a little hard to see, given Iran's own sort of domestic concerns right now. It's hard to see how they respond to that. But it kind of opens a Pandora's box in the Middle East again that, if not completely closed, was seemed manageable before this latest development. So, and of course, all of those things create crises for the Biden administration to deal with, in addition to the direct problem of US and Israeli relations. I saw a report, I think Axios was it, or The Hill, saying that the Biden administration is considering telling Bibi that they will not deal with Ben-Gvir if he's in the cabinet. I can't see that as a sustainable way of doing business. The Biden administration, or the United States historically, has done business with countries all over the world that have got completely obnoxious people in government. I mean, some of them are our NATO allies. So I can't imagine that is sustainable.
Who did you have in mind, Bobby?
Let's see, Turkey, Italy. I don't need to go on. So, the US is going to have to grit its teeth and do business with Israel as it always has. And if things in Iran continue to go off the rails as it has done, that relationship is going to be even more important than before.
Probably not a fist bump, though, right? Just to put that out there. James, jump in here.
I think it's so interesting and so difficult. I'm Jewish, and so I guess, like lots of people, it's hard to respond to this without being emotional. But I'm not sure, Bobby, that the America deals with Israel as it always has, for one of the reasons that I thought Tom Friedman touched upon in his column, which is right. For a lot of American Jews, the question, which is, do I support this Israel or not, will be a very difficult one, particularly the point he makes about students on campuses. This will be really difficult. And I found myself reflecting on it, just thinking to myself, as a kid going to Israel, staying on a kibbutz, that kind of kibbutz collective culture of Israel, that's a very, very long way from where we are now. I was in Israel, in Eilat, on the night that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in 1995. 1995, assassinated, remember, by Yigal Amir, a far-right murderer. And I suppose even in that weeks after that, being there and that sense of unity that was in Israel, we're a long, long way from that. People will find it hard to work out exactly how to deal with Israel, I think, in that context. I would just make those 2 points, if you don't mind, Ivo, which I think are worth reflecting on, both in the Brazil case and in Israel. One is demographics, and the other is democracy. There is something going on in the politics of Brazil, which is around the birth rate amongst Catholics and evangelicals. There is something going on in Israel between the secular and the Orthodox birth rates. These things have an impact over time on political calculations, and we're seeing that happen now. Secondly, democracy. Democracy is obviously at war with itself. It is dealing with the doom loop that Susan describes, and the battle is between the ballot box and the rule of law. And the only reason I'd give you a little bit of grounds for optimism in the Israeli case is if you look at the strength of the rule of law, I think the pursuit of Bibi through legal means was quite powerful and quite effective last time, and I see no reason that it's going to stop. And so that's the one reason why I think that this story doesn't end here with his election and this new coalition. I think we'll find that actually the legal checks on him are quite powerful.
I certainly hope you're right, because that is the core. You know, a democracy without a rule of law is not a democracy, whatever happens at the ballot box. I'm sure we'll be watching that closely. Bobby, we're running out of time, but it is important that we talk about Ethiopia, which you have written a lot about over the years, and we have not really spent enough time on the program on this. A truly horrendous war with extraordinary casualties, as brutal as anything we've seen, and now with a growing famine. And yet, all of a sudden, a ray of hope with a negotiation led by the African Union, completed in South Africa to have a peace agreement. Remind us what this war is about. Like most wars, about power, but in what sense, and what should we think about the fact that the two countries, or the two sides, have now come together to sign an agreement in the same room on the same piece of paper, something that we don't see the Ukrainians and Russians doing anytime soon, I think.
Well, I'm gonna have to simplify given the constraints of time, but basically what you have is a civil war between the central government run by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and a rebel force in the northern province of Tigray, called the TPLF. Abiy was trying to centralize more authority in his government, in his capital, but the Tigrayans, who previously for many years ran Ethiopia, were determined to hold on to their autonomy. 2 years ago, things came to a head. Abiy ordered his forces into Tigray. The Tigrayans fought back. It has been a bloody civil war by some, and part of the problem is that the Abiy government is preventing international agencies not only from supplying aid, which is horrific. These are his own citizens, remember, but he's also preventing the media and from any kind of monitoring going on in what's going on in Tigray. So we don't have an accurate bead on the actual death toll, but some studies suggest that it's already in excess of 500,000 people, many of them from the fighting itself, many of them from starvation and other diseases. The Tigray has 7 million people. It borders both Eritrea. The Eritrean government is helping Abiy's forces, and to some extent it borders Sudan, and there is already an enormous crisis of displaced people within Tigray, people who've had to flee as the government forces have advanced, flee their villages and towns. Some of them are now sort of trickling into Sudan, a desperately poor country in itself, and that flow will probably increase. There is a truce. There was a truce for a few months during the summer. The United States, among others, helped to engineer that. The African Union, after having failed miserably over 2 years to try and get something done, has finally arranged for another truce. Piece of paper, as you say, has been signed. I am not wildly optimistic that that will hold, that will contribute to a lasting peace. The lesson we learned from the previous truce was that Abiy used the 5 months that he had to quickly build up his forces, buy weapons, including drones from Turkey, to try and then turn the battle to his advantage. I fear that might happen again. But I am, as folks who watched me on the show know, a natural-born cynic. I think the rest of the world has a duty to try and prevent the worst from happening, or at least to prepare for the worst. That Sudan is going to need a lot of help with these refugees. A lot more pressure needs to be brought to bear on Abiy to hold back his forces, and the Tigrayans themselves need to be told that there have been accusations of abuses and war crimes on their part as well. They have to back off. I want very badly to believe that this truce will hold. I don't think so.
Well, it's ordinary people who are caught in the middle, and in this case, not only by the fighting, but by an extraordinary famine that is descended on this part of the world, and is affecting. I think it's the largest humanitarian and hunger crisis we've seen in 40 or 50 years.
And a rock concert is not going to help this time.
Yeah, and a rock concert is not going to help. Although it'd be a good start. So we'll have to ask Bono to he's got his new memoirs out, so maybe he can start thinking about redoing that. But in all seriousness, I think the bigger problem, and James, Susan, we're running out of time, but if any of you want to jump in, I think the bigger problem is exemplified by our discussion. It comes at the end. It's not the natural everyday, every week issue. It just tends to be ignored. As the moderator of the show, I'll claim I'm guilty on that. But we as an international community really need to think about how we help those people who are at least as affected as what others in the war. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ivo, all I would say is that the whole conversation today is a sign of a kind of an international order that has not held, and that there's nothing really or no prospect of replacing it. The West, in that old sense of the word, doesn't really exist, and the sort of unipolar superpower moment of the United States is clearly over. We are in an internal crisis that makes us so inward looking, I have to say. There's very little bandwidth for crises, unfortunately, in the rest of the world. And, if you're looking for a sort of external factor, it's not going to happen. Even Israel, which has been the subject of so much attention, it's not on the front pages of the American newspapers. This is like a seismic development, potentially. Brazil, same thing. Unfortunately, I've heard repeatedly that, senior officials of the Biden administration express dismay about the situation with the war in Ethiopia, and acknowledged to me quite openly their inability to really do more than to send a senatorial envoy here and a delegation there. And I think it's a sign of a country in internal crisis that we're going to be inward looking, not just now, but for the foreseeable future.
James, give us hope from the outside.
No, I know that we're out of time. Firstly, I think, Ivo, you're doing yourself down. Actually, the fact that we're talking about Egypt and the Tigray crisis is a credit to you in the show. It needs to be talked about more. Most people aren't talking about it at all. But I was just shaking my head vigorously, Susan, because I have to say one thing. I think 2022 has made me see the world fundamentally differently, and primarily with regard to American power. I think what you said about the era of the unipolar superpower is over. Actually, I think 2022 should make us rethink that assumption, because if anything, the reality of the war in Ukraine, there is only one power in the world that is setting the terms for engagement with Putin. The fact that Xi Jinping has chosen control over growth has weakened China's prospects of, certainly in my lifetime, ever overtaking the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act not only has sluiced trillions of dollars through the US economy and given it great power, but also makes it likely to control the terms of the green technologies in much the same way that it controlled the terms of the internet technologies. My bet in 2022 is that the most likely sole superpower of the next 30 years is the United States of America. And I think that people, not least Americans, are writing that off too soon.
So, Ivo, I know we have to go. Here's all I would say. Like, James, I appreciate and I actually agree. And I think your China analysis is spot on in many respects. But even that has not been fully absorbed here in the United States, because this crisis is real, and it has an international component that is often mistaken from others. This part of the Trump agenda and that of his most fervent followers is for real. They seek not to play a leadership role in the world. And this crisis is accelerating, not decelerating. And I understand, the fervent, wish to return, to some kind of a normal scenario. But I can assure you that if Donald Trump becomes the president of the United States again, everything you're saying is completely inoperative.
So I think the good news is or bad news is you're both right, and the United States is
chopped liver.
Bobby, Bill, I'm running out of time. You're not chopped liver. You can say you have the last word.
No. I'm saying they're both correct, and I'm not.
You were absolutely correct. Hopefully, you're wrong on the Truce not holding in Ethiopia, but so do you. I mean, I do think there is. 2022 has shown something about American power. It also is showing us how we can defeat that, and the only people who can defeat it is Americans ourselves. It won't be defeated by someone else, and I think that's the importance of the moment that we're in, and in some ways the politics that we've been talking about, including in Ethiopia, and Nobel Peace Prize winning Prime Minister taking down his own country. For political power. That's what it's ultimately always about. And we'll be back shorter next time, but this was too good not to continue next time for another edition of World Review. Susan Glasser, James Harding, Bobby Ghosh, always great to have the three of you on. We get spirited debates and lots of information, which is what we want. Tune in next week. Actually, don't tune in next week. It's Veterans Day in the United States. It is Armistice Day in much of the rest of the world. It's an important day that we will celebrate. We'll be back in 2 weeks for another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.
Thanks, Ivo.
Thank you so much.
Guys, this was terrific. Thanks so much.